Charlie Gammell is an historian and former diplomat who was on the Iran desk at the Foreign Office. He has also written extensively for publications such as The Spectator and others. And a bit of a departure today. We're going to be talking about the Middle East, specifically Iran, Syria, and Russia, because a lot has gone on, some of which you can see in the sort of broad headlines, but there's a lot of interesting undercurrents that we're going to be exploring today, the changing power relationships in the region. And of course, Russia's loss of influence in Syria is a huge, huge blow in its neo-imperialist phase that we're seeing at the moment. Welcome to Ceiling Curtain. Thank you to everybody who is supporting the channel, watches these videos, everyone who has subscribed and put helpful, useful comments, even some of the derogatory ones. We tend to have a better class of troll on this account, and even the trolls seem to try to engage in some semi-sensible dialogue. So that is quite a nice thing. That we managed to achieve there. Thank you to everyone who's helped crowdsource the trucks that are being sent over to Ukraine. They're going to make a huge difference. And thank you to everyone who supported our current campaign for the journey that is going to take them over there, which, as many of you know, Jonathan M.S. Pierce and myself are going to be on, along with a lot of other fantastic characters. But let's get into the topic today. Charlie, welcome to the channel.
Jonathan, great to be with you. And I sort of joined this podcast as a fan, and I really enjoy listening to your podcast, particularly the ones on China, as this is a bit of a departure for me to go into talking about China and Russia, or listening to a podcast about China and Russia. I really enjoy them. So a few words about me. As you said, I've sort of since about 2007, I've been working in various guises on the region as a historian, as an aid worker. I've been an interpreter in Afghan prisons, as a diplomat, and as a consultant and an analyst. And I suppose something that I try to bring is that long-term view, historians' dispassionate approach to it, and also the slightly sort of more pragmatic diplomatic approach, which I learned slightly later in my life, and then a really keen desire, as you say, to get under the skin of these things that are happening. So, what is going on in Iran? What is going in Syria? Why is it going on, and why is it important to us? And as you say, I think that what we've seen in the last 2 months or so has been a complete change in the dynamics of the Middle East. And you will know better than I how that touches on Russia's power projection into the region. But a fascinating time for anyone involved in the region, and a potentially quite a hopeful time for people joined in the region if you look at the ceasefire that's been agreed yesterday. But lots to get into, incredibly complicated currents of conflict and alliances that have happened. So I really look forward to getting talking about it with you.
Fantastic. Well, let's start with the story that people will be aware of because it's had some coverage, and this is that obviously the regime in Syria, Assad regime, collapsed incredibly quickly. No big surprises. Assad ended up in Moscow, in the the retirement home for brutal dictators. Oh, to be a fly on the wall of that institution. There's some rather unpleasant characters there who probably don't get on too well between each other as well. But the regime collapsed incredibly quickly to the point where we saw Russia trying to get its assets out of the country, but at the same time trying to negotiate continuation of access to Tartus, Latakia, and the sort of the naval and air bases that had been considered critical to Russia's global logistics chain. So, first of all, let's react to that, just the speed of the collapse of the regime. I think it took the media, it took almost everybody surprised. There must be some people, though, who weren't necessarily quite as surprised because they were involved in the planning over, one would assume, many months and even years of this operation taking place.
Yeah, so I think if you go back to 2020, a ceasefire between Russia and Turkey around Idlib, and the creation of this area in Idlib, which HTS began to occupy and rule. Since then, you had HTS, which is a loose coalition of Sunni Islamist groups that have their roots in Al Qaeda, in ISIS, in various other Sunni insurgencies across the region. They started arming, they started organizing, they started preparing, and in the relative peace that came off the back of that peace deal between the Russians and the Turks, this group started preparing for an assault on Damascus, and with the support of Turkey. So, and the analogy I always use is that you have Pakistan's support for the Taliban to give them strategic depth into the region. Very similar situation here with Turkey and HTS. Turkey has been supporting these groups for a long time against the Assad regime. What you had in Syria basically is the advent of sanctions, Western sanctions on Syria, led to Assad having to find alternative revenue streams. One of the things he did to plug that revenue gap was to start producing this synthetic drug called captagon, which is wreaking havoc in the region. And effectively, this turned the Assad state into a narco state. And if you are a narco state, then you're probably going to spend less time putting that money where you need to put it, which is to beef up your army, which is to build schools, which is to build roads, which is to do all the things that you need to do for a functioning economy, state building, nation building, let's call it. And a lot of that money and attention went into the funding of this narco state. It's also really important to say that the Russian help and the Iranian help into Syria didn't come with lots of investment in Syria to build it up as a country, as let's say the Americans had tried to do in Afghanistan and tried to do in Iraq. So you had this hollowed out state run by a minority Alawite grouping, the Assad family, that had become a byword for kleptocracy, a byword for brutality, and a tyrannical state in name and in reality. And I think for me, the writing was on the wall when HTS had started their raid south. Assad said, we will up the pay of our employers, our army and our intelligence by 50%. And as soon as I heard that, I thought, well, the game's up here because if you've got to double people's pay to get their loyalty, that sort of toppling point from loyalty to not loyalty, it's tiny. And suddenly, in 1 second, people started to go over. I mean, there were some fights against HTS, but ultimately they just moved through because people surrendered. So I think the speed of the fall of Assad, if you look back at what he'd built or what he'd failed to build and the brutality with which he treated his own people, it's all there. Everything's there. And I think what we also saw is that Russia's commitment to Syria was made prior to 2022 and the invasion of Ukraine. And actually, and as you would know better than me, Russia's really, really, really concerned with Ukraine in a way that an outpost in the Middle East that has relative value to its operations in Africa, it will ditch that if it means being able to focus more on the effort in Ukraine. So I think that's what emerged very quickly from Russia's withdrawal. It wasn't interested in another war in Syria. And it did, and it had some token air attacks on HTS as they were coming south. But as you heard from an Iranian general whose comments were leaked to the Iranian press, these bombing campaigns they were desultory. They missed their targets. They hit civilians. There was absolutely nothing good in them. So I think when you saw Russia's very minimal response to the advance of HTS, it was very clear that they weren't going to hang around because they can't afford to fight another war. And what you've seen them do is from well now their ships are sort of loitering off the base of Tartus while they try to reach some kind of negotiation or a diplomatic solution with HTS. Those discussions are ongoing. I think last point on that is what's interesting is if I've been following this for a long time, from May 2024, Russia was starting to move some of its hardware from Tartus to eastern ports in Libya, where it has a good relationship with Haftar. And in Libya, despite the ongoing civil war and the sort of latent instability, what Russia sees in Libya is it's got a port into the Mediterranean and it's got land borders into Africa through which it can project influence. So, if you were very cynical, you could say, well, Russia's known this is going to happen for a long time, and that's why it's been moving some of its assets out, and that's why it's incredibly keen to reach some kind of a settlement with HTS. But the speed of this was dramatic at the time, but when you look back, it was not actually that dramatic because the groundwork had been set. And last point there is that it's very similar to Afghanistan. Everyone was shocked at the speed of the fall of the regime. But when you looked back over that summer and you looked at the ground that the district centers that the Taliban had been taking, the same deals that they were arriving at with the Afghan forces, it's a similar situation that you have in Syria.
And this is a fascinating thing that jumps out. It's not on my list of questions, but this idea that you have this massive inflationary process of having to keep your agents and assets of the state on side by loyalty. I don't know whether it's loyalty, but at least by their services to keep you in power. We see an extraordinary inflation in the rates that are being paid to conscripts by Russia. And again, it's interesting to sort of see that potentially as a sign of Russia's regime weakening rather, the need, this massive inflationary pressure for those agents and assets that are required to not just keep the war going, but keep the totalitarian state moving. Is there some commonality, do you think, there in this particular indicator?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, legitimacy and sort of patriotism, legitimacy that the Russians have and that the Syrian regime had, what that doubling of their salary showed was that this was a very transactional relationship. This wasn't sort of love of country that these people had, these Syrians who were not just Alawites, but Sunnis as well. If you start to do things like that, as you're seeing in Russia, it is an indication that people don't want to fight for you anymore. If there's a job you don't want to do and someone says, "All right, I'll offer you three times," you might think about doing it. And I think that's the same in the job market as it is here. And yeah, absolutely. I think that is an indicator of a loss of legitimacy amongst soldiers who aren't willing to lose their lives for a cause that perhaps they don't believe in anymore.
And is there therefore more of, let's say, an ideological or moral political motivation behind HTS? Because yes, factions tend to have, as you pointed out, factions tend to have their patrons, and with that comes, funds. But to achieve the kind of results you're achieving, one assumes that HTS are not built on, this mercenary concept alone. There are other things behind this victory, values which they will potentially want to see, unfold or be implemented.
Absolutely, and I think it's something which I was talking to someone who was in Syria at the time yesterday, and we were talking about HTS's march south. And from what we can see and from what we know, the instances of sort of burning and looting and raping on that drive south were remarkably few, which does tend to suggest that there's a popular acceptance of HTS, either because of what they stand for as a predominantly Sunni entity in a predominantly Sunni country that's been ruled by an Alawite minority for a long time, or because they were welcomed as liberators from oppression. I think that is definitely been a feature, and people who've been in Syria since the fall of the Assad regime, they've said you can feel on the streets this palpable relief that you no longer have this regime, and by virtue of that relief, HTS are naturally cast in a very favourable light. However, I think within HTS, you've got countervailing tendencies, and you had the same with the Taliban's alliance with Al Qaeda. And again, I'm going to be drawing on these parallels because I think they're quite illustrative. You have in HTS someone like Jolani who is a nationalist. He is an Islamist, but he is a nationalist. For him, an inclusive, prosperous, united Syria is something that he wants and he has been fighting for. And obviously, his journey has not been a smooth one because he's been affiliated to Al Qaeda, he's been affiliated to Jabhat al-Nusra, he's had these affiliations along the way, which tend to suggest that his view on jihad is transnational. So it goes beyond the borders of Syria. But where he's arrived at is this Syrian nationalist. The challenge I think he's going to have is that the people who helped bring him back to power within his group are Palestinian Jordanians, they are Egyptians, they are Chechens, they are Saudis, for whom the jihad doesn't end at the borders of Syria, for whom the jihad will continue into the Caucasus, will continue into Gaza, obviously. So he will have to manage those tensions in his cabinet because he has to portray himself as an acceptable face of a multi-ethnic and a multi-faith Syria and a multi-sectarian Syria. And yet at the same time, he has to satisfy those people who've been with him on the journey. So I think you've really got those two tensions that are going to inform or how well he manages those tensions will tell us a lot about the viability of the HTS project moving forward.
And there will be tensions amongst patrons as well, because you also have, as you explained to me earlier, Kurdish minorities who play a key role. And we, of course, saw in Iraq the fall of Saddam Hussein, the significant role that the sort of Kurdish independence fighters sort of played there. But of course, the one of the main patrons of HTS supposedly is Turkey. Not a huge fan of the Kurdish minorities. Not a huge fan of, let's say, them consolidating and creating a sense of nationhood, organizing and getting stuff done. How is this potentially going to play out?
Yeah, I think first of all, before we get on to the Turkey issue, I think it's important to say that the SDF has been a key ally for the West in the fight against ISIS. And the victory against ISIS has been something that the West claims as theirs, the Iranians and the Russians claim as theirs, and obviously the SDF will claim they played an important role in that. And there's truth in all of those. The SDF has also been, and talking to a Syrian friend the other day, taking territory south of the areas in which people in Syria feel it is entitled to take territory. So there will be a push and pull between HTS and SDF around some of that territory. And from what we can see, those conversations have been amicable. There was fighting after the fall of Assad between in the north with involving HTS and SDF. The challenge, I think, is going to be that exactly as you said, the Iraqi state was the Iraqi state benefited from the incorporation of the Kurdish Peshmerga from Kurdish parts of Iraq into the Iraqi state. And they have this kind of federal system with Erbil and Sulaymaniyah within the Iraqi state. The challenge for the SDF is that they need to harness the power, the HTS needs to harness the power and the military force of the SDF and to do so in a way that doesn't, as you say, anger its patron Turkey. Now, Turkey sees the SDF as having a very strong link to Kurdish fighters in Turkey who are at absolute loggerheads with the regime, with the government in Ankara. So that is the big tendency, that the big tension that they're going to have to overcome. And how that happens, I'm not sure. If you look at Donald Trump, when he basically withdrew American support from the SDF, that was a green light for Turkish warplanes to go and bomb Kurdish civilians and SDF fighters. That is going to be a really key, watching Trump and Erdogan and how does that play out? What arrangement is agreed on that will be a really, really important thing. And as I said, you've got these countervailing tendencies. You have where Pakistan and the Taliban were on the same page and they had these same interests, they could work together. Now that the Taliban is the government of Afghanistan, there has been a divergence. And I remember speaking to Taliban people about that relationship. And there was, on the one hand, well, they were grateful that the ISI provided them with weapons and training and know-how, but there was a bit of frustration that we're not their sort of lackey. We are an independent group and we're fighting for Afghan nationalism and all these things so those tensions will be there between HTS and Turkey, despite the incredible support that Turkey's given HTS over the years and effectively enabled them to take Damascus.
That's absolutely sort of fascinating changes there. And this is a huge loss for Moscow, but it's also a huge loss for Tehran as well, because the deployment and use of Tehran's allies, proxies, and agents throughout the Middle East is one of those big stories of the undercurrent of what's sort of going on. We see what's happening with the Houthis, and we see the influence in southern Lebanon and so on. So, how big a loss is this defeat of Assad for not just Moscow, but also Tehran?
Yeah, I think that is an excellent point, and almost the biggest story of the fall of Damascus regionally has been the loss to Iran. If you cast your mind back to 2011, when the Arab Spring was kicking off, there was someone called Mehdi Tayeb, who's a very close advisor to the Supreme Leader, and he was asked about it, and he said Syria is the 35th province of Iran. If we lose Syria, we wouldn't be able to hold Tehran. And that clip is obviously doing the rounds, or that comment is doing the rounds in Iran, amongst the types of people who you imagine it to be doing the rounds from. And also you had Hashemi Rafsanjani, who is dead now, but he was a pragmatist figure from the revolution, who at the time of Iran's intervention in Syria to prop up Assad said, "This is a terrible idea. It will end very badly for us." And then Khamenei replies and says, "What are you talking about? You don't know anything." And again, this clip of this interaction has been doing the rounds amongst anti-regime people who are saying the regime doesn't really know what it's talking about. But why was Syria so important to Iran? So Iran used Syria as a transit point through which to give weapons to Hezbollah, which was absolutely key. Hezbollah is a sort of an adjunct of the IRGC in many ways, even though it stands for its own things. But it was set up by the IRGC. The first IRGC soldiers in 1983 who went to Lebanon to help set up Hezbollah went through Syria. Syria is a transit point for weapons, it's a transit point for people. There were tons and tons of IRGC and Iranian military personnel in Syria. A lot of military know-how was used to prop up Assad. And without Syria, Iran can't really project its influence into Lebanon. Iran can't really claim to stand up for Hezbollah. So, and what you're seeing, I remember at the time of at the start of the Lebanon, when Israel invaded Lebanon in September last year, I wrote that this could destabilize the Middle East to such an extent that you could lead to the rise of ISIS 3.0. And because at the same time as you had Israel invading Lebanon, you also had Israel striking Shia Iran-backed militias in Syria that were supporting Assad. And my point was that if you destabilize Syria to such an extent, you could open the door to the advance of groups like HTS that would come and take Syria from Assad. So this destabilization of the region, because of Israel's sort of short-term successes, has absolutely dented Iran's prestige and actually dented Iran's ability to project power in the region. But there might be unintended consequences for this, of this sort of destabilization of the region for people like, let's say, Israel, because it might lead to the rise of Islamism. And if you look at if you sort of cast your mind from Syria to Iraq, which is the other big nation in the Middle East that Iran sets a lot of store by and has very close links with, there's the potential that Iraqi fighters within HTS will start to move their gaze towards Iraq and say, that's next. And that's why you have the Iraqi foreign minister was in London yesterday, and one of the big things he was saying is that we want to integrate the PMF, which is the Hashd al-Shaabi, which is Iran-backed Shia militias. They want to integrate these militias into the Iraqi government to strengthen Iraq as a nation against some of the stuff that they're worried that's going to happen as a result of Syria. So it's not just a loss to Iranian prestige in Syria. There's the potential for Iraq to destabilize further. And that would be even more of a blow to the Islamic Republic.
And there's an interesting phrase we were talking about, which you mentioned, which maybe it's a simplistic model, but it speaks to some of the sort of paranoia that no doubt you have in regimes such as Tehran and Moscow, and that is lose Syria, eventually lose Tehran, lose Moscow, in terms of losing them from the authoritarian sphere and the
Yeah.
authoritarian model that both of those countries not only inflict on their own people, but seem to want to project and propagate around the world. So is this too simple to think of it in this way, or is there some truth in this sort of idea of falling dominoes?
Yeah, I mean, it's important to stress that Khamenei and Putin share a theory of revolution. They share a horror of the color revolutions and a sense that behind every protester in Moscow or Tehran is a Western security service or a Western intelligence agency backing these individuals. This has been a topic of conversation, and Russia and Iran shares know-how on how to counter this kind of stuff. So how to suppress and control your domestic population to uphold regime stability. I think that, I mean, the domino theory, obviously, without wishing to sound too much like a sort of a Cold War warrior from from some of his friends with Kissinger, I think there's every possibility that as Iran loses prestige in the region, and I'll speak to Iran here, people in Iran are beginning to look at it and think, we've spent billions of dollars on propping up the Assad regime. We've lost countless soldiers on propping up the Assad regime. We've spent billions of dollars arming a regime and supporting a regime that is no good for the region. And yet we can't afford to heat and light our schools, our hospitals, our government offices, our malls, because we're so sanctioned because of our isolationist kind of policies, not in a Trump way, but in policies that cause them to be isolated. So the regime in Tehran is very confused about how to deal with this. I mean, as America was when Afghanistan fell, there's a lot of like, oh, feet shuffling and umming and awing, but it was really interesting to watch Khamenei come out after Syria had fell. And I expected him to potentially be conciliatory. I expected him to potentially be equivocal, but in a very halting way, he went on the attack and said the axis of resistance, which is Iran's network of proxies around the Middle East, is strong. The axis of resistance will keep fighting, and the axis of resistance will keep pushing back. And it just didn't ring true. And there is a sense, in speaking to people in Tehran, the regime is unbelievably rattled by what's happened in Syria because and why it's on the back foot regionally. And what people worry is that it might be forced into making concessions to America when Trump comes in, which again will weaken it in the eyes of its people, which could lead to popular unrest. At which point, the kind of all bets are off, given the levels of popular unrest that we've seen in Iran over the last couple of years. So, predicting the future is a hazardous thing, particularly with Iran, but it has been weakened, and this idea that it is in a position where it doesn't have answers to some of these questions that are being asked of it, that is really clear from within Tehran and Tehran in the region, as it were.
And it's interesting that the concept of autocracy in Russia could be weakened by something external to it in this way, by a weakening or loss of other allies and proxies as well. And certainly that paranoia seems to be walking the corridors of the Kremlin. I think you certainly get that sense from the propagandists who were going out of their minds when it was quite clear that Syria was going to be lost. But they also have other interests, such as in the Sahel and
Mhm.
sub-Saharan Africa. And these aren't just ways of Russia projecting power in the Cold War sense, as you say. It's also about this sort of mafia money making, sort of not even kleptocratic, but these are out and out kind of mafia operations to, gain extracted resources, generate funds that can then further support, other what we would define as illegal and disrupting activities. How important is the loss of Syria logistically to Russia in this sense as part of their global plan to keep some kind of presence going in the Middle East and in Africa and other areas?
Well, I mean, I would say the sort of historian in me would say that these ships in Tartus they haven't left, some of them. The discussions between Russia and HTS are ongoing. So I think that we don't know yet how deep this loss is to Russia. And as I said, since May 24, there's been an attempt to sort of diversify some of that reliance away to Libya. But again, Libya is not Switzerland. Libya has its own internal problems, and there is a civil war going on there, and there's a lot of violence going on in that country, which would mean that this is not necessarily the most sustainable of choices for Russia to house its ships and what it needs to do. But so I think that yeah, Russia in Africa will have to find different ways of projecting influence there. Having said that, I think you look at somewhere like Mali, the relationship that Russia has with the Mali government, it goes back quite a long time, and it goes back to Cold War times. I remember that when I was working in North Africa and sort of loosely, I would sort of work a little bit on that part of the Sahel. There was a sense that the ties that Russia had built up with the Malian government did go back quite a long time. And I think what they're trying to do is, you look at Mali, the French left. The ability of the West to effectively counter the Islamists in the Sahel, it wasn't particularly good. And not that Russia's any better, but it was there. It could offer a sort of a marginal improvement with a sort of relatively small outlay of money. And they're doing that across the region in these sort of what you might call non-aligned bits of Africa. Burkina Faso, for example, places that have got problems, they can go in there and say, "We'll help you." I suppose the damage to Russia, it's in their reputation. How strong an ally is Russia of you? At what point will it just cut and run? Which is why I think for the optics, it was so important for Russia to get Assad back into a tower block in St. Petersburg or Moscow, because it's the only way of Russia showing to its allies, if everything goes wrong, we'll give you a nice flat to live in. I think otherwise they would have looked really, really bad. But I think, yeah, they are trying to pick off countries that are what they would call non-aligned, where there are big problems, where there's an Islamist insurgency, and they're obviously doing that for their own reasons, but as in to protect sort of internal, as they would say, Russia from Islamism in Russia. But they're also doing that in a very opportunistic way.
And that's the extraordinary bit, isn't it? Is this the we will not abandon you ultimately? That's been a hallmark of Putin's regime, actually. Even extraordinary incompetence shown by the likes of Shoigu and others has not always met with punishment, or at least not that we know of. It's only outright disloyalty, such as Prigozhin. Another aspect of what's happened, though, and I know this wasn't intentional, but as you mentioned earlier, an Iranian official was actually, a recording of a conversation was actually made public, and that shows a little sort of light on some of the tensions that might exist between the partnership between Russia and Iran, because yes, they're aligned on certain interests, and indeed every day, tens and tens of Iranian designed drones, quite potentially with many parts manufactured in Iran, fly over Ukrainian cities. Without that support, Russia would not have been able to carry on its campaign of terror. So there are areas where they're aligned and cooperating, but this shines a light on some of the areas where they may diverge or criticize each other behind the scenes. I know you listened to that conversation. What impression did you have of that?
Well, I think just sort of to start by saying is that, today on the 17th of January, Russia and Iran have signed a strategic partnership agreement that's been in the works for a long, long time. And that covers everything from trade to military to finance. And it's a big scope, an agreement which will set the foundation for the next however many years of Iran-Russia cooperation. And previously, the Russia-Iran relationship was very much Russia dominant and Iran sort of subservient and begging, Russia to help it build its power plant at Bushehr, for example. But as you say, Iran's ability to provide Russia with these Shahed drones that have been crucial in the war in Ukraine has slightly tilted the balance, not necessarily totally in Iran's favor, but has brought more parity about in that relationship. And an example of that is that Russia is starting to pass captured Western munitions from the Ukraine battlefield to Iranian military technicians, who then can analyze these bits of military kit that they find on the battlefield to help them develop countermeasures at a massively discounted rate. So this is something that would have been unthinkable how many years ago. The partnership has deepened. The partnership has involves intelligence sharing. It involves a lot of sharing, which would have been unthinkable 5 or 6 years ago. So I think it's important to stress that this is a very deep, strategic, institutional partnership. Absolutely, all these things, as these partnerships have, they will have teething problems at the top. You saw in August 2016, Iran gave access to of some of its military bases to Russia so that they could attack Syrian targets from Iran. This caused an absolute bun fight in the Iranian press because it is against the Iranian constitution to allow Iran to be used by foreign military, even if that foreign military is an ally. So Iran's history with Russia, I mean, it goes back a very long time. They've fought lots of wars with each other. There've been the Treaty of Turkmenchai. There's been Golistan. There've been all these treaties in which, effectively, in the 19th century, Iran ceded all of its land, a lot of its kind of Caucasus, northern Iran into Central Asia, all of its land to Russia. Iran has historically seen Russia as this acultural, barbaric swamp, and Russia has seen Iran as you can imagine in the Orientalist imagining. So historically, this is not a good relationship between these two powers. Historically, this is a relationship built on pragmatism and isolation. And when Iran says it's going to stand up for the oppressed Muslims of the world, it rings very hollow when its two biggest allies are Russia, which has a questionable track record on Islam, and China, which has an even more questionable track record on Islam. However, if you look at the Crocus City Hall attack, it was Iran that shared intelligence with Russia in the lead up to this, saying you are about to be attacked. So it is a very close partnership. Having listened to that leaked audio, it's clear that there's a huge sense of frustration in Iran, and there's a desire to blame someone. And Iran loves a conspiracy theory, and part of that tape suggested that Russia was allying with Israel to engineer a departure for Russia that was swift and bloodless. Um, and you can hear the frustration that comes through that. And I think you can hear, I think towards the end, one of the things he says is that we tried to get Assad to talk to the Russians, and Assad says, I can't talk to the Russians because they won't listen to me. You need to talk to the Russians. And it was this slightly Kafkaesque, as everything was burning, they were having these conversations about who could talk to whom. So I think what came through that more than anything else is the frustration of Iran at having lost this key ally. And it's a bit of scapegoating, a bit of blaming, and a lovely Iranian conspiracy theorist saying that effectively Iran and Israel were cooperating at the end, which therefore absolves Russia and Israel were cooperating at the end, which absolves Iran of some of the blame on its own, and it can shift the conversation towards Russia as opposed to towards Iran.
That's the most bizarre idea to come out of that because, but then again, there's been some speculation as to Israel's relationship with Russia and its, at this point, lack of support for Ukraine or lack of visible support. So there's some very strange, messy games going on behind the scenes. Well, that's maybe one for another
Yeah.
conversation for sure. What this also seems to show is the absolute brittleness of the kind of narco-led dictatorial power that we saw, especially one of the most brutal kind. And I think the image that a lot of people will be familiar with, of course, is not all these undercurrents of politics, but is the physical image of opening up the prisons, seeing the absolutely barbaric results of many hundreds, if not thousands, of people held in those conditions, and of course attests to the many thousands who never made it out, who would have died in those prisons before being liberated.
Yeah, and the and unfortunately, I think in that tale of a brutalized people, you have the potential for this brutality to be repeated in the next generation, and I say in the next iteration of Syrian power, which is the HTS. And one thing that you're really getting a sense of is that they don't want history to repeat itself. And the Syrian intelligence services, the new ones as it were, are making a conscious effort to reintegrate former Syrian intelligence officers into the new project because they know that these people were obviously they were free agents morally and they could have not worked there, but there's a degree of coercion, there's a degree of choice there. And I think HTS is taking a refreshingly pragmatic approach to the reintegration of these people into the new regime. And yeah, I used to work in Afghan prisons, and they are very, very, very inauthoritarian and fundamentalist regimes. These prisons are where some of the most god-awful things happen, and the danger is that it's the cycle is perpetuated, and you're in this kind of Greek tragedy type generational conflict that just goes on repeating itself. And there's a great book about Iraq by Justin Morozzi called City of Blood, City of Peace. And it talks about the violence of the Saddam regime having antecedents in the violence of the previous regime. And then it goes forward to the violence, the absolute wave of violence that erupted after 2003. It didn't come from a clear blue sky. So this cycle of vengeance that HTS is going to have to stop if it wants to have a chance of building a cohesive and inclusive Syria, that is a really important thing. We saw in Afghanistan when the Taliban fell, the Taliban weren't in 2001, they weren't integrated into the new Afghan project. They were sidelined. You had a country dominated or a government dominated by Pashtuns, which is the Taliban, and you had the sort of Tajiks and the Uzbeks and the Hazaras down here. When 2001 happened, you had a complete flip. So you had the same problem of imbalance, you had the same problem of vengeance, and that the inability to break that cycle led to the perpetuation of a conflict that we still live with today. So that is a big, big challenge for HTS at the moment, and they are trying to grapple with it, which can only be a positive thing.
And of course, in the context of of a benign world, that might be easier, but we're not entering a benign world. We're entering one that comes to resemble far more the sort of great game, the great clash of imperial powers that we saw in the 19th century, the 18th century, the desire for colonization and to seize lands for their value in terms of extractive resources, markets, and so on. We're entering a very uncertain period here. But it seems that Russia and to an extent Turkey and Iran, this is fairly familiar territory to it. Whereas perhaps in Britain and Europe, we've got out of the habit of playing these far more naked kind of power games, far more brutal kind of games.
Yeah, and I suppose the I think this is a challenge that you have when you're trying to create a foreign policy that is moral. Because a big driver, and that's not me saying that you shouldn't have morality and ethics at the core of what you're trying to do in the world. Absolutely, you should, because these are the values on which we exist and which make countries like the UK and America far better to live in than anywhere in the world, in my view. However, pragmatism is a key driver of foreign policy, and understanding that. is something that is very difficult for I suppose democratic systems to do. You can almost feel you look at the fall of the Taliban, the first countries that had their embassies there were Russia, China, Iran, Pakistan. Your countries not famed for their love of human rights. And that's not me praising their agility, their sort of diplomatic agility. It's just pointing that out. And I think that that is something that the West will have to grapple with as it moves forward. How do you deal with HTS? How do you deal with the reality of an Islamist fundamentalist group that has taken control of a country? Um, what is the narrative that you spin there to your domestic audience to allow you to engage with these people, and how do you push that forward? And I think I've often thought that having a very moral outlook on our foreign policy, it leads to hostages to fortune. I think our stance on Ukraine can look slightly empty when set against our stance on Israel. When you look at the 50 to 100,000 Palestinian civilians that have been killed since October the 7th. Again, and I'm not drawing moral equivalence here, but I'm just pointing out that it's quite you can create tensions with some of the way that we operate, and I don't have a way to resolve that, but I think you're exactly right in there has to be some evolution in the way we look at this, because some of these authoritarian regimes are stealing a march in the region and in the world on areas where we feel a bit slow to get our act together.
And the danger is that there's apologists as well, aren't there? For every kleptocratic and unpleasant regime will find either willing or paid for apologists to muddy the waters. And this is the last era. I mean, Assad regime was actually quite good at it. It had voices within the establishment saying, "Yes, okay, it's a dictatorship, but." That's just part of the local culture, and what follows would be far worse. And there's ways of spinning stories that result in inaction or muddying the waters, as it were. And then there's ways, of course, of pointing at what Israel's doing, but failing to point at what Assad did to his own people. I mean, for the last couple of years, horrific brutality gone on there. So there's these let's say yeah, people will manipulate and use and abuse stories for their own ends. And we have to get across that, don't we? We have to tell better stories about the textured reality of what's going on.
I mean, absolutely. And I think I've noticed this in the discourses that you have people who are opposed, for good reasons to what is going on in Gaza, and potentially and also what's going on in Lebanon. They automatically think that the people who are supporting the Gaza or Hamas and the people who are supporting Hezbollah are naturally good, and that Hamas and Hezbollah, because they are fighting against this kind of onslaught of civilian casualties in Gaza and Lebanon, that they are automatically good. And I suppose it's the inability to hold two thoughts in your mind at the same time. And I've noticed with kind of great dismay, I mean, people I know very well who are intelligent, informed observers and sometimes practitioners in this stuff, particularly in the Middle East, you find them more and more arguing for a sort of a Russia-Iran-led region. My mind fries when I hear about that, because not least because I think, well, where were you when Russian planes were dropping bombs on hospitals in Aleppo, doing exactly the same as what Israel is doing in Gaza on schools? Where were you when the Iranians were doing what they were doing on the ground, and their militias were doing what they were doing on the ground? And it's just, I think exactly as you say, we have to find a way to tell these narratives which can encapsulate the good and the bad. Because I think if anything comes out of these conversations that we'll do on the Middle East, it is an intensely complicated place. And having a hitching your sort of self to one particular, say, oh, I'm team this, very quickly you end up looking like a bit of an idiot, because it's not. I don't think it's. I mean, obviously you can have you can be on one side and the other, but the complexities here need to be acknowledged first and foremost, and need to be understood first and foremost, I think, before you can work out where you want to go. And I think I see myself. I'm a very apolitical person, even though I'm a very patriotic Brit and know where I stand on a lot of issues. But in this area, I see my role as to try and, I suppose, enunciate some of these nuances and these complexities, not to a particular political end, but because we need to understand what's going on in here, because this is important.
That's right. And it's so easy to spin simplistic narratives to solve complex problems and never actually get to a solution if that's the kind of rabbit hole that people go down. That's why this has been such a refreshing conversation in an area where, I don't have that background knowledge and don't necessarily feel as confident. This was a thrilling conversation with so much detail in there. I know it's going to be appreciated by the audience. And just a heads up, we will be conducting more conversations about more aspects of the Middle East politics, and we will be taking a much deeper dive into Iran and the origins of the regime in a future conversation, which people in the channel can look forward to. But for today, Charlie, thank you so much.
Jonathan, thanks. It's a pleasure to be with you.